Good afternoon. Welcome to the Kirby Center of Hillsdale College. I'm Matthew Spaulding, Associate Vice President Dean, here for Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C. At Hillsdale College, those of you who are familiar with us know that we actually do believe America is an exceptional nation. This country has had a discussion about exceptionalism for some time now, part of it because of the rise in our politics of discussions about America. What has been lacking in that discussion often is the source of that exceptionalism, the substance behind the claim. In a debate over whether it is or is not, you need to have that substance to respond to the arguments that American claims of exceptionalism is merely jingoism. We have a great speaker to talk about that topic today, to talk about how we should understand the concept, but also how we should talk about exceptionalism in our politics, because that's very important. As is our tradition, he's going to be introduced today by a student of ours currently on the Washington Hillsdale Internship Program, Bronte Wiggin. She's from Montana. She's a major in politics, a junior, a minor in Spanish, part of the George Washington Fellows Program. On campus, she is an RA involved in Students for Life, and she's currently interning across the street in the Center for Principles and Politics of the Heritage Foundation. Bronte.
Good afternoon, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. James Caesar. He's a professor of politics at the University of Virginia, and he's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He received his PhD from Harvard University in government, and he has taught as a visiting professor at Oxford, Princeton, and the University of Florence. He is also the author of several books, including Reconstructing America, Liberal Democracy, and Political Science. Please welcome Dr. James Caesar. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and nice to welcome Matt over here and on this side of Massachusetts Avenue. The United States Constitution, ratified some 225 years ago, is frequently referred to as our foundational document, because it sets out the basic framework of our political system. The Constitution has, of course, been changed and altered over its history, in 27 instances by formal amendment, and in many other cases through interpretation, whether by the courts exercising judicial review or by political leaders working their will through the political process. But the Constitution still stands, and it retains a good part of its original character. If it is asked why we hear President Obama deploring almost daily what he calls gridlock in Washington, because Congress sometimes thwarts what he wishes to do, and why his opponents in Congress welcome this standoff, regarding it as a salutary check on executive power, again because it thwarts what President Obama wishes to do, the underlying explanation is rooted in the Constitution. The very way in which the Constitution assigns and allots powers among the different institutions allows, if it does not encourage, this kind of deadlock. The subject I wish to introduce this afternoon is the Constitution and American greatness. Now, the diligent pupil will always adhere strictly to the assigned topic, making certain to define carefully its key concepts and terms. Having spent a long career as a teacher, preaching fidelity to this low but solid standard, and severely punishing any student who dares to show the slightest hint of creativity, I feel duty-bound this afternoon to practice exactly what I preach. By the topic, the Constitution and American greatness, I shall be looking to see if there is a connection between the Constitution and American greatness. Merely to talk about the Constitution and American greatness and to assume that because these two things may exist in the same place, that they are related, that's insufficient. The crux of the topic must be to show how the Constitution causes or is the source of greatness, if it is. I will eventually set the bar even higher, carrying diligence almost to the point of obsession, and ask how the Constitution by itself, and not as a consequence of any of its secondary effects, directly contributes to greatness. But let me follow the obligatory preliminaries and define the key concepts. Let's start with the Constitution. It's easy to characterize the Constitution. It refers to a written text called the Constitution of the United States that has some 4,543 words. It's comprised of the original document, ratified in 1789, and its amendments. The words may be copied on faux parchment for sale in souvenir shops, printed on paper in textbooks of American politics, or displayed, as is more often the case today, in electronic image replete with fancy hyperlinks. None of this matters. It's the text that counts. All other questions that trouble the erudite, especially law professors, such as whether the Constitution is living, dying, or merely convalescing, these are issues of analysis, not of basic definition. More challenging, obviously, is to define the concept of national greatness. Most discussions of greatness focus on the individual person, not the nation, on figures like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, or going back to antiquity, Alexander the Great. In Alexander's case, and here you could add Cyrus as well, it's hard to be ranked more highly on the scale of greatness than to be given the epithet the Great, to be attached to one's name. I mentioned that this is an epithet in memory of the embarrassing moment of a UVA student who once asked in a public lecture how it was that someone could have the last name of the Great. A number of scholars have written fine books on the subject of individual greatness, but do the qualities that comprise greatness in an individual resemble or shed light on the qualities that define greatness in a collectivity? Many have heard of, and perhaps even had the occasion to look at, the Nicomachean Ethics, a book written by Aristotle. In that work, Aristotle provided what some consider to be the classic portrait of individual greatness, which he presents under the imposing title, The Great-Souled Man, or the GSM for short. On first impression, it seems that some characteristics of this singular creature have little to do with anything that might be applied to a nation. For example, the GSM is said to walk slowly and to possess a deep voice. Yet nations do not walk. On the other hand, allowing a little room for metaphor, this description of the GSM is in line with Theodore Roosevelt's comment, which he thought germane to American greatness, namely to speak softly and carry a big stick. Or again, the GSM is described by Aristotle as intent on bestowing favors while always reluctant to accept them. This strange kind of pride might seem initially out of place for a nation, though again, second thoughts should be entertained. When President Putin last fall so graciously stepped up to offer his assistance to America in the matter of resolving the problem of chemical weapons in Syria, was there not something that detracted from our national greatness in accepting the kind favor? And are we not now perhaps reaping the harvest of these seeds of supineness that were sowed at this time? In fact, it's surprising how much our founders thought could be learned about national greatness by studying individuals. James Madison in Federalist 62 reminds his readers that, I quote, "One nation is to another what one individual is to another." He then proceeds to describe the lamentable situation in which America found itself under the government of the Articles of Confederation. I quote, "She," meaning America, "finds that she is held in no respect by her friends, that she is the derision of her enemies." Words just like this, one suspects, would be highly familiar to the great-souled man. Getting out of this deplorable situation also, as Alexander tells his readers in Federalist 11, will allow America to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world. Yes, in this quote, there is a consideration of interest, but the language speaks more to the importance of pride. At the end of the day, however, national greatness is a concept that must be understood, at least partially on its own terms, as a distinct phenomenon and not entirely as an analog of individual greatness. Four characteristics, I believe, capture the idea of national greatness. Not all four are needed for a nation to be great. Perhaps just one will suffice, but here are the four. First, a great nation will have the means and power, economic, diplomatic, and especially military, to impact other nations in the world. And the great nation must use that power for what can plausibly be described as a noble or commendable end. The power can be employed defensively, say to stop a conqueror bent on crushing and enslaving others, like the Spartans did at Thermopylae. I get that from seeing the movie 300. Or power can be employed offensively to build an empire or hegemony, like Rome did in antiquity, or Great Britain did in the 19th century. From these empires, we derive the laudatory terms Pax Romana and Pax Britannica, which are celebrations of those nations' greatness. The great nation, and I include here a city-state or empire, while it will consider profit for itself, though it will sometimes be reluctant to admit it, thinks beyond its own material well-being and considers the interest of the empire as a whole or of the whole world. Thus, the great nation is distinguished from, say, the Belgian Empire, which conquered just to plunder. The great nation conceives that the world needs an order, and that it is the responsibility of the great, for greatness is characterized by assuming responsibility, to create and maintain what is of general benefit. A great nation is not content to lead from behind. It wants to assume the mantle of leading without complaining of weariness. Second, a great nation will bestow a gift on the world, a gift that adds to the stock of goods that comprise civilization. Athens to this day is renowned for what Pericles proclaimed in his funeral oration. You'll remember these words: "We are lovers of beauty without extravagance, and lovers of wisdom without effeminacy." Other examples of nations that left a legacy to civilization are Rome, which contributed so much to civil law, or the Dutch Republic, which helped build the modern system of commerce and trade. These are cultural or scientific or humanitarian gifts that provide ornamentation to what it is to be human. Now, in the two characteristics of greatness noted to this point, it's important to keep in mind the distinction between good and great. There are nations that are good in the sense of behaving like orderly and reliable neighbors, regularly, so to speak, taking out their trash and cutting their lawns. Some nation in today's world will pay their United Nations dues on time, contribute on occasion to international peacekeeping forces, and vote dutifully to limit the dangers of climate change. These nations do not aspire to greatness. Indeed, many of them argue, rightly or wrongly, that the world would be better off without nations that aspire to greatness. It is the pushing and jostlings of the great for honor, they say, that leads to strife and contention. Great nations, by contrast, aim for something commendable. Admittedly, a term of art that's vague, but still, this at least is clear. Great nations talk about greatness, or to use an American synonym, they talk about exceptionalism. No one talks about greatness in the Duchy of Luxembourg. No one extols exceptionalism in Bulgaria. An American leader who most frequently had a concern for greatness, though perhaps he took it beyond all bounds of proportion, was Theodore Roosevelt. If Americans aimed, as he said, to be a really great people, they must, and I quote him again, strive in good faith to play a great part in the world. They must be capable of feeling that the mighty lift the thrills of stern men with empires in their brains. It goes without saying that Roosevelt's own words perhaps on greatness go a little bit too far. He might think of his own idea that greatness should speak more softly. Greatness also does not adhere to a single pattern or formula. It fits a variety of forms and shapes. It's hard to say exactly what it consists of. It can be accompanied with significant flaws. But greatness aspires to be higher and more noble, even if the end it seeks does not always bring all that's hoped for. Third, a great nation plays a role in shaping the destiny of the world. A great nation is commissioned, to use Hegelian language, to lead humanity to its next stage of development of spirit. In a different but related account, a great nation might be one chosen by God to play a role in his providential plan. As John Milton wrote of England in Areopagitica, why else that this nation was chosen before any other, that out of her, as out of Zion, should be proclaimed and sounded forth the first tidings and trumpet of the Reformation of Europe. Of course, in this religious context, the language or term of greatness would be avoided, as it would suggest a human replacement for the real source of power and greatness, which is the Almighty. Finally, and here's a fourth characteristic of greatness, a great nation is one that produces a new and worthy mode of political organization. Such a nation's legacy is found in its political order, which it bequeaths as a model for others to admire and perhaps emulate. In classical times, Sparta's republican regime was often singled out for praise, and in the 18th century, most admired England, which was the model regime for Montesquieu, because England protected the liberty of its citizens. Now, Americans often lay claim to possessing national greatness, and most others in the world recognize this too, though sometimes begrudgingly. What is remarkable is that Americans can stake a claim to greatness on the basis of all four of the characteristics I noted. First, what of power, and power used for commendable ends? On the ledger of defensive actions, America helped to save the constitutional democracies of Western Europe from autocracy, from Nazi conquest, and from communist domination. South Korea and Kuwait would not exist today but for American might. And who can say what the fate of Israel might be absent American power? On the ledger of offensive action, America has shaped the security system of the modern world order, and it has built the world's financial system. America is not an empire in the old sense, seeking to conquer and hold territory, but neither is it a nation like any other today, content just with living and letting live. It has been the indispensable nation. Many contend today that a large part of America's political leadership and an increasing number of its citizens wish to renounce this role. America is dramatically cutting its military spending, and it has been treating its dollar more and more like a local currency than the world's reserve currency. It is too early to say yet whether these signs mark a permanent change of direction and turn in America away from greatness. The current administration is known best for its transformation of affairs in the domestic arena. But its most consequential change has arguably been in the area of foreign affairs, where its aim has been to make us act, think, and feel like a nation that is just like all other nations. Again now, by the standard of cultural or scientific accomplishment, America has made a tremendous gift to civilization. No, I'm not referring here to our pervasive popular culture of dance and song and film, which penetrates into every corner of the globe. The verdict is still out on the depths of these contributions. How will twerking ultimately be judged in the cool light of history? Besides, especially in song, some of the greatest, like Justin Bieber, are natives of other countries. But where America clearly has made its singular and massive contribution is in its innovation in modes of production and in the uses of technology. These accomplishments have led in the past 2 centuries to a stunning rise in the standard of living, not only for Americans, but also for millions of people throughout the world. Again now, by the criterion of promoting a mission, America has played a central role in shaping the destiny of the modern world. Hegel said as much, and Tocqueville proved it. America, wrote Hegel, is the land of the future, where, in the ages that lie before us, the burden of the world's history shall reveal itself. It brought the idea of rights into the world, and it proclaimed the equal status of the common man. As for a religious mission, America playing a part in sacred history, scholars of American history will tell you that many Americans once thought in these terms, especially the New England Puritans, with their notions of building a city on a hill. Many, even today, however, cringe at any such notions, which they regard as an embarrassment to the nation and also to faith. Perhaps it is. On the other hand, when you think about it, it's not beyond the bounds of faith or reason to consider whether there may be a special role for this almost chosen people in providing a safe haven for biblical religion and in offering a modicum of protection for those threatened and persecuted around the world in its name. But let's not get sidetracked on matters of theology. Finally, on that criterion of creating a worthy political model, America has staked its greatness on a new form of government for the modern age. America offered, as Abraham Lincoln once put it, something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world to all time to come. The transformation of the form of government that is taking place in so many places around the world is a result of the shot heard round the world. I love the encomium that James Madison pronounced for the revolutionary leaders in Federalist Number 14. It is enough to bring one to tears, though I confess to be one who gets a lump in his throat at a ceremony for the opening of a new shopping center. Still, listen to James Madison. Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race, they pursued a new and noble course. They accomplished a revolution which had no parallels in the annals of human history. They reared the fabrics of governments which have no model on the face of the globe. Obvious questions loom today about whether America can remain great. Indeed, about whether America wants to remain great. What, many ask, is so great about greatness? Greatness, it is said, is too costly, too burdensome, or simply not worthwhile. On the one side of the political spectrum, many see greatness as an impediment to achieving the higher goal of social justice or equality. On the other side of the political spectrum, many think greatness conflicts with the higher goal of individuals enjoying fully their individual rights. For both of these groups, national greatness is a fool's errand. Well, let me not, however, wander too far on the question of whether Americans want greatness, but return diligently to the question of the connection between the Constitution and greatness. If, as it's said, America can rightly proclaim its greatness, and if the Constitution forms the basic framework of our government, then given the importance of government to society, doesn't it seem reasonable to contend that the Constitution must somehow be a precondition or cause of our greatness? Not only does this seem to be a logical inference, but in the case of some of the characteristics I discussed, evidence can be adduced to show that many of those involved in creating the Constitution consciously sought to create a nation that would be powerful and creative, that would alter the destiny of the world, and that would provide humankind with the model of a new form of government. Yet at the same time, however, intellectual rigor demands that we not assign all causal power regarding greatness to the Constitution. If the Constitution allows for greatness, it in no way mandates it in all the respects mentioned. If we look at matters historically, it's clear that we would not have attained greatness in the way that we have without deliberate decisions taken by political actors along the way. And in almost every case, alternative paths were open and advocated that would have led in a different direction. In the early 19th century, we could have renounced ever becoming a continental nation and clung to the eastern seacoast. Many preferred this. In the mid-19th century, we could have acquiesced to the division of the nation into two countries. An entire political party was prepared to do so. In the 20th century, we could have shied away from ever becoming a military power able to protect beyond our own continent. Isolationists and pacifists pleaded along these lines. All of these choices would have been equally constitutional with the steps that we did take. We could abandon greatness tomorrow and choose to be ordinary. We may be doing that just now without violating anything in the Constitution. As for the gift of economic transformation and technological innovation, it would be nice to believe that the Constitution was responsible for the internet, but everyone knows it was created by Al Gore. Nothing in the Constitution ever demanded that we undertake the collective mission of space exploration. John Kennedy decided to make it a national project, and he brought Americans around to embracing it in the name of achieving the right stuff. In a clear renunciation of greatness, we have effectively abandoned the goal of reaching Mars. No one has alleged that this decision is a violation of the Constitution. As for our mission in world history, some cringe today even at hearing the word mission. It seems to have lost any command over the imagination of our youth. Will we ever again hear exceptionalism in this sense praised in a presidential campaign? Mr. Putin might not allow it. Yet for all this, our political system is no less in perfect compliance with the Constitution. For these reasons, and in due diligence, it cannot be said unequivocally that the Constitution has caused American greatness in all the areas surveyed. So I accordingly propose to take a slightly different path, one that shows how the Constitution, almost by itself, including the act of designing and adopting it, has contributed to national greatness and pointed the way to approaches to governing that have been a model for the ages. The Constitution, its conception, production, and adoption, stands as a monument of achievement in the theory and practice of governance. Well, what are the elements of this case? First, the American Constitution lends support to the idea that governments can be made successfully. Proving that governments can be made or founded is the first criterion of significance or greatness that's mentioned in the Federalist Papers. It is a theme that opens the entire book and is found in a very complex sentence written by Alexander Hamilton. I'll read the sentence, listen carefully because it's easy to lose your way in it. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Not exactly a sentence by Hemingway. Now, I used to think this sentence was nothing more than a complicated rhetorical flourish. It seemed to propose two wholes or pairs, a government formed by reflection and choice on the one hand, and a government that results from accident and force on the other. And then to say that all good manifestly lies in the first option, that is, of opting for reflection and choice, and that all error lies in the second, that is, being resigned to being controlled by accident or force. This evaluation I took to be obvious, accepted by anyone, and in no need of proof. And yet, in fact, the decision between these two pairs is not so clear. An argument could be made that force is preferable to choice, and especially that accident is preferable to reflection. The Constitution of the United States becomes a focal point for considering this theoretical question. Whether good government is produced by reflection rather than accident, it turns out, was a central question of political philosophy in the 18th and 19th centuries. The idea of making a government from reflection as a product of philosophy or science goes all the way back to Plato in his Republic. It was embraced, this idea, by Machiavelli, who spoke of a new prince in a new country, and more politely by René Descartes, who proposed constructing governments anew from plans derived directly from reason, as an architect could plan for a house or an engineer for a bridge. But a whole school of thought, beginning with Montesquieu and continuing with Hume and Burke, grew up in opposition to the wisdom of making and remaking governments. Good government, this school said, should instead grow by accretion. Edmund Burke is best known for this view. As he observed in speaking of his beloved England, which of course has no written constitution, he said it was not formed upon a regular plan or with any unity of design. Rather, it developed in a great length of time and by a great variety of accidents. Its parts, he went on, gradually and almost insensibly accommodated themselves to each other. Putting this point in its most emphatic terms, Burke said, "The very idea of the fabrication of a new government is enough to fill us with disgust and horror. This almost natural process of growth and accommodation through accident is known in political thought as the organic model of constitutionalism. Now, proponents of this organic approach offered several reasons in favor of their position. The act of making government anew has something about it of the character of tyranny. After all, power is radically centralized as the society is remade, or otherwise it could not be remade. The forces of restraint and limit are ignored or destroyed. Furthermore, the example of remaking sets a precedent. If everything is remodeled or remade once, then there's no reason why it should not be remodeled again, just as one tears down a building deemed obsolete and replaces it with something new and better. Promoters of the U.S. Constitution presented the case for the possibility of making or new modeling government, as they called it. This is the starting point of a theory of government that flows directly from the United States Constitution. The Constitution was the first real test for a nation of whether remaking could be carried out successfully. Modernity, for better or worse, has been shaped by the American example. And yet, while coming down on the side of remaking, the Constitution, as we'll see in a moment, and its authors represent a unique case inside this category of remaking, for the reason that they sought to do the most possible within a framework of making to take account of the reasonable concern of these organic objectors. The second point in the theory of government that attaches directly to the Constitution is the concept of founding or founders, or what is sometimes called in political philosophy the legislator or the lawgiver with capital L's. The founder represents the pinnacle of political greatness. No other function in politics enjoys a similar status. A prince or statesman, however brilliant, works within the mold forged by the founder. The founder refers to one who sets in motion the plan for a new order, who conceives or designs the plan. This could be the reflection part that Hamilton is speaking of, and who carries that plan into execution. It goes without saying that a nation established under the organic model does not have a founder in this sense. Great Britain has no founder. Indeed, it is one of the purposes of the organic theory to deny, or at least to downplay, the function of founding altogether. Many of those involved in establishing the Constitution were conscious of this function or office of founding. The Federalist, in particular Federalist 38, is one of the most important reflections in political theory on the theme of founding and founders. This essay should be studied along with the classic treatments of this theme, which are found in Machiavelli and Rousseau, where there is discussions of such figures as Moses and Romulus. Now in Federalist 38, James Madison likewise surveys some of the great lawgivers of antiquity, including Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta, and Solon, the founder of Athenian democracy. The authors of the Federalists, by treating this subject, were inviting a comparison of America's founders, that is themselves, to these greatest of political figures of the past, and they were offering themselves as models to replace the ancients. The existence of individuals of such high rank in America is a paradox. A constitution that abolishes rank and nobility and that begins to establish popular government is paired with a view that suggests an expansive hierarchy in the realm of our thought about politics. Greatness is a concept that asks the rest of us to look up to something, in this case, to look up to the founders. The idea of founders underwrites the entire concept of greatness in American politics. We are an egalitarian people, but a people that is supposed to look up to something. This notion is still sufficiently powerful to supply on its own a rebuke to those political pygmies who slight the Constitution, like the previous Speaker of the House of Representatives, or to the haughty intellectuals like the young Woodrow Wilson, who from ambition or envy would replace the Constitution. The only persons in the world today who merit the title of successful lawgivers are the American founders. Others who have vied for this status may have held it for a time, but they've all fallen by the wayside. In the former Soviet Union, the outside statues of Lenin have mostly been torn down, and their stone turned into dust. Mao, though still formally credited, does not supply the model of China. Even Ataturk, the modern lawgiver who went so far in transforming the habits and mores of the Turkish people, is now seeing his project challenged and undermined. Only one set of persons enjoys the real status of founders. It is the Americans. Now, third, the Americans stand as a monument of greatness because of the way in which they made the Constitution. Elaborating on the way in which the founding took place is one of the founders' main objects of reflection in the Federalist Papers. As Madison noted, we are to admire, I quote, the improvements made by Americans on the ancient mode of preparing and establishing regular plans of government. The adoption of the new Constitution was by choice or consent rather than force. Here was an important difference between the American case and most of the classical foundings. The American founders were not, like many of the ancient founders, acting from a position of complete command, able to compel acceptance to the Constitution by physical force or by the manipulation of superstition. The founders embraced this limitation, even as they acknowledged that it took a toll on the wisdom of the Constitution. The requirement that the Constitution had to be ratified by the large body of the people is, I would say, the decisive fact in the establishment of popular government in the modern world. In all human affairs, the initial example tends to be the most important one, which sets the precedent for all that comes after. I compare the American case to the European one, where various versions of the European Constitution have been submitted to referenda in a number of countries, including Denmark, France, Ireland, and the Netherlands, where it has always been rejected. Never mind, the elites continue to build Europe and even to pass a constitution. Does that show you anything about the spirit or manner in which governance takes place in Europe? The requirement of informed consent for the Constitution introduced another element into the distinct character of the American founding, which differentiates it from the foundings of antiquity. Since neither force nor superstition could be used, America's founders by necessity had to employ a different form of political discourse. Of course they used rhetoric, but the more striking fact in studying the founding is the degree to which rational argumentation became a part of the exercise of ratification. It set a standard for political discussion, rarely adhered to, but a standard nonetheless. The exercise of popular choice or consent in the adoption of the Constitution is an event in the realm of practice that has entered into and altered political theory. One of the great inventions of modern political theory was the idea of the social contract, which is prominent in the thought of John Locke and others. The idea of the contract was widely considered as the juridical source of legitimate government. But this idea was always more of an hypothesis than a fact. It was written about in books, but it never could be located literally in history or practice. The use of popular choice in adopting the Constitution became, in effect, the first concrete example of the social contract. This example has taken over the hypothetical theory of the contract and transformed it into an institutional reality. The idea of adopting a government by reflection, rather than allowing it to be formed by accident, opened the door in politics to a new intellectual force. Reflection, for the authors of the Constitution, meant not only deliberation by the founders among themselves, but the introduction of political science, both in the form of the observation and analysis of the effects of the operation of the state constitution, and in the consultation of great classic texts of political science of the age. Of course, as the unending stream of exercises in debunking the founders inform us, there was much political horse trading and bargaining that went on at the Constitutional Convention. We have barely recovered from the shock of learning that the founders were politicians. But the fact remains that the main elements of structure in the new government find their source in the science of politics, as the Federalist and as a reading of Madison's personal notes prove. We would not have had the American Constitution but with the study of the texts of John Locke, Montesquieu, and David Hume. In other words, we wouldn't have had it without political science. Here then is another monument set in motion by the Constitution. The writing of the Constitution brought political science down from the realm of theory and transformed it into an active force in shaping political life. America's government owes more to political science than does any other nation, and political science owes more to American constitutionalism than it does to any other nation. The fate of America and of political science are intertwined. This connection has one more chapter. The founders who made use of political science also developed it. The Federalist is a major contribution to this science, the most significant so far produced in America, and one that now enjoys widespread respect alongside of the classics of political theory throughout the world. The Federalist and the Constitution stand together as a pair, the twin towers of America's contribution to political thought. The most important point in the way that the Constitution was offered appears in a new instrument, namely a written Constitution. Founding a new government by the means of a written document is a point now so widely accepted as to be taken as second nature. We have forgotten the innovation that it was, an innovation in this case that began in the American states. Thomas Jefferson pointed this fact out. Americans, he said, were the first of the nations of the earth which assembled its wise men peaceably together to form a fundamental constitution, to commit it to writing, and place it among their archives where everyone should be free to appeal to the text. He was referring in this case to the establishment of the Virginia Constitution. Proceeding by means of a written text was, in one sense, a necessity, given the prior idea of public consent. The public had to consent to something, and it was only by seeing that thing in writing that people assembled in different places in different times could conduct the exercise of ratification. But the significance of a written text immediately went far beyond the demands of the procedure of consent. The written text, fortified now with the idea that it instantiated the social contract, became the highest power, standing above the government. The authority of government derives from the Constitution, and no office and no official can exercise legitimate power except insofar as it is consistent with the Constitution. The teaching here is that will is subordinate to law. The final point in the Constitution's contribution to modern government is the founders' theory of keeping or maintaining the Constitution. It's not self-evident that a Constitution, once written, can or should remain in effect for a lengthy period of time. In fact, the logic of making a government almost suggests the opposite. Why not repeat the exercise in making when more is known and when reason arrives at better solutions? This was exactly the conclusion drawn by Thomas Jefferson when he called for a rewriting of the Constitution every 19 years. Most of the founders took a different view and pointed out the dangers likely to result from such a proposal. Their arguments are found throughout the Federalist, but most notably in Federalist number 49, which goes furthest in pointing out the reasons for why the Constitution should be maintained, and also shows how it would be maintained. The mechanism for maintaining the Constitution rests on attaching to a written document the idea of veneration for a written text, veneration supported by the solemnity of the idea of founding. When one thinks about it, it's by no means logical, and it was by no means the practice to connect reverence or veneration to a written document. Even today, it would be a strange kind of person who would profess reverence for, say, the Constitution of Illinois. The dimension of reverence was deliberately added as a way of stabilizing the Constitution and helping to ensure its longevity. It makes the Constitution into something more than a paper or a parchment on which it's written. The Constitution comes to occupy the status of symbol of the nation, beyond the will of any particular institution or leader. For this reason, I chose, upon solemn reflection, to place Federalist 49 on my license plate. By this means, I hope to remind all on the road, especially the willful who tailgate, of the importance of fidelity to the Constitution. And even if someday, in the far, far distant future, the Constitution, like all things mortal, shall have ceased to be in effect, the license plate will by chance be uncovered in some junk pile and serve to remind people of the Constitution as the monument of Americans' greatness. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. If you'd raise your hands, and we have 2 microphones here as well. I start asking questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that, oh, thank you.
You're on the air too.
You mentioned that great nations are characterized by their use of power for commendable ends, hence the existence of democratic Korea, Kuwait, Iraq. These are all wars that Americans fought to ensure their independence, but none of these wars were declared by Congress per Article 1 of the Constitution. Is it problematic that we pursue national greatness in spite of the Constitution?
Yeah, leave Korea out for a minute, which is really a larger problem than the other two. I think we've adopted a mechanism which is tantamount to Article 1, which is, was in effect both in Kuwait and Iraq. Let me say a word about that. I think really coming up to the war in Kuwait, George Bush, the senior, proposed the idea, as many others, that the president could take the nation into war by himself, and insisted that that was inherent in the powers of the executive. Congress pushed back, and was especially angered at the fact that the president might cite authority from the United Nations rather than from the U.S. Congress. And a large battle ensued between the two branches on that point. And here's an important side point to make. I don't think that most constitutional issues are decided by courts. They're often decided in the political process. And such was the case then. I think the constitutional understanding that emerged was that if you want to start a real war, meaning a war with a lot of troops moved a long way away, you have to have consent of Congress. I think that's where the Constitution is today. I know we had this incident in Libya, and President Obama tried to get around it one way or another, but he did point out this is not a real war in the sense of committing American troops. In subsequent instances, Iraq and whatnot, you had to have the consent of Congress to begin those wars. That, I think, is where the American Constitution is today. As you know, there are a lot of technical reasons why declarations of war have been shunned, that make it a little bit problematic. But we have something tantamount to it and something very close to the spirit of the Constitution, I would say. So, final point, don't always look to what the court says for the Constitution. Look to settled practice.
Thank you. In talking about the question of the relationship between the Constitution and American greatness, I was thinking of another Constitution which was very, very similar to the American Constitution, the smallest number of differences, and it's the Confederate Constitution, which, if you read, turns out to whole sections of it are just ripped out of the U.S. Constitution, with one major small difference, and that was the making slavery a permanent institution in the Confederate States. It strikes me that an awful lot of what you said about the American Constitution, which is very true, a great deal of it could be said or could have been said ultimately about the Confederate Constitution as well. That is, let's suppose that the Civil War had been successful from the point of view of separation. Full consent could have been provided. The people who wrote the Constitution were not inconsequential men, they were interesting and good founders, and a great deal would have been similar. But there was one big difference, right? And that is that the one is rooted in principles of equality and liberty, and the other is rooted in the principle of inequality. So the question I'm asking you is, I almost found it kind of surprising that you don't seem to have addressed what the relationship is between the principles, say the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and American greatness, which seems to me at any rate, to be more important than anything else, including the Constitution, except insofar as the Constitution embodies those principles in a structure. So.
Well, I accept your point. You could say a little bit of the division of labor. Maybe I assumed too much about the importance of that. It is interesting. This Constitution, without the principles on which it's founded, would be a very different document, and who knows whether it could have laid claim to greatness on its own without that. Say this, it's very interesting you mentioned the parallels, and there's some differences between the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of the Confederacy. Not only that, when it was established, or at least afterwards, it was established on the exact American model of founding as well. Namely, that you had to have a first principle, or as Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, said, a cornerstone or a foundation, which is what you were referring to. And he said the problem with the first Constitution, which we're founding a government in the same way, starting with the foundation and building a structure on top of it. The problem was that the original founding was based on a false cornerstone, which was false, an understanding of science, which was false, and only now have we come, he argued, to a true understanding of science, which is the principle of inequality of the races. So there was parallelism throughout. It's just that they were in a way mirror opposites, but they approached the idea of governing in this, of founding in the same way. Articulate a central foundation and then a structure which embodies that. So I endorse your comment, and almost ashamed for not mentioning it.
Jim, thanks for a very nice talk. I appreciate it. I want to go back to the organic Constitution just for a moment and get you to say again concisely what counts decisively against an organic Constitution of practice and.
Yeah, I'm not sure I grasped it. That was the alternative to the idea that you would remake.
You were introducing it in a very amenable and
well, sure, because
way.
yeah.
And now I want to, but why isn't it? What counts against it?
Right.
That it just doesn't work, or does it have some theoretical deficiency?
Yeah, good point, because in a way this is a debate, and it's very important in a way for conservatives, because a large part of conservatism is grounded in Edmund Burke, and opposition to idea of making, or remaking, or founding something anew. In fact, you could say a large part of conservatism was based against the idea of A, revolution, we had one, and B, redoing a government, we did that. Now, of course, in the minds of the conservatives, the model that they had to counter in the practical circumstances was France, not the United States. The United States was guilty of these sins only because of France, not vice versa. Somehow or other, Burke and the others had to counter the excesses of the French Revolution by, in a way, offering an alternative view. Well, what about the American case? What I mentioned is the American case is a case of making, but it's a case of making that, as you read the Federalist Papers, you see it does almost all that's possible to accommodate every prudential concern raised by the organic theorists. An instance of this is maintaining a permanent written constitution. The logic, you could say, of remaking, as I pointed out, is probably to keep remaking. Jefferson, in this way, is a perfect example of the spirit of remaking. This is the thing that the organic theorists were worried about. There's a lot of wisdom, therefore, in the organic model. A final point to which I don't exactly subscribe, but there's some truth in it, is to say, well, when you look back in it, how much really did the American Constitution redo? They thought they did a lot, and they did do a lot by establishing the Constitution. But put on a comparative scale, looked across other nations, the Constitution and what it sought to remake was fairly limited and fairly modest. That is to say, compare it with the idea in France, which you not only establish a new government, but tabula rasa, your intent and design is to reformulate the entire character and mores of the people. Not so of the American Constitution. Had important but limited ends. And in this sense, many people look back and say that America, in a way, adopted and embraced huge parts of the tradition that were already working and built its models on certain practices that already existed, which is to say, it wasn't quite as innovative as sometimes we like to say. So there's something in that. I meant to bring up the organic model to keep it alive as an option, and to show maybe that all truth doesn't lie with one view or the other. Certainly, in my view, the idea of remaking has great dangers in it. And if you remake, you have to do so in the most careful of ways. You have to do the remaking, as I said, that's most consistent with the rational objections of the organic mode of thought. And I can't think of any document or exercise that does this better than the American Constitution.
Question about what constitutes greatness. In the 19th century, America was great in many respects without intervening in other people's messes around the world. In the 20th century, there was this theory that there has to be some nation that sort of maintains order, and it has to be America and so forth. But what do you think that the world would be like if America did a lot less of that and pulled back, and maybe not so much in Europe and Japan, but pulled back mainly in the countries that don't seem to appreciate it? And would it still be, what would the world be like without a Pax Americana, in your personal opinion?
Yeah, well, we're testing that. And there's something to be said on both sides, because you can easily say that in this effort to, say, have a kind of American empire, I put empire in quotes, but a kind of American world order, that there have been serious mistakes that have been made. Any great enterprise is going to have errors as well as decisions that are helpful. So it's a question that has to be raised. It's been the question debated, especially inside the academy, for the last 50 years in studying courses in international relations and whatnot. This has in a way been the issue. Would we be better off if we hadn't assumed this role? So the answer will come maybe if we test this thoroughly. You ask my own view. I don't think the world can exist peaceably without an overarching order. So that's the lesson I would draw from history, that it won't work. That in a way, behind a successful world order, there has to be an ultimate force, or a kind of policeman, a gentle policeman, but a policeman who sets certain limits that all recognize. Otherwise, chaos will be the result. Well, what do I base this on, besides, I suppose, political prejudice and everything else I'm usually accused of by my students and whatnot? I look at certain historical examples. I note to point in the study of the Thucydides Peloponnesian Wars, where for a moment of time, Athens and Sparta both step back, and you have this long, boring part of the Peloponnesian Wars, where it's pages and pages of chaos. All these little nations are jumping on others, fighting each other. The world falls into chaos without some sort of order. That, I think, will be the result. I think as a result, we would have established much more without British power. Obviously, I can't prove this to anyone. I can only suggest this is the case. And as I said, we may be testing whether this is true. We haven't had a long enough test. That has to be said. But I don't know if you're content with where you see certain things going, a world without that force standing behind it that sets certain limits. If that's where we're going, I think we maybe can begin to see some of the dangers that are part of that world order.